What if the life you were living was only a fraction of the one you were meant to have? What if a single act of kindness, an impulse to help a stranger in a world that had shown you little but hardship, could unlock a door to a past you never knew existed? For one waitress, a woman whose spirit refused to be broken by the weight of her struggles, a single cup of coffee offered in defiance of cruelty would change everything. This is a story about a tarnished silver locket, a secret buried for decades, and a test of character so profound it could either shatter a forgotten legacy or resurrect it in a blaze of truth and justice. The rain fell on the city in relentless, weeping sheets, blurring the neon signs into watercolor streaks on the grimy windows of the Corner Spoon Diner. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and fried onions, a scent that clung to Alara Carter's clothes and hair long after her shift ended. At 26, Alara moved with a grace that belied the bone-deep exhaustion settling into her marrow. Every step was measured, every movement efficient, a choreography perfected over 6 years of balancing plates, refilling coffees, and smiling at customers who rarely saw the person behind the uniform. Her smile was her shield, but tonight, it felt heavier than usual. The stack of bills on her small kitchen table seemed to grow taller each day, a paper monster threatening to consume her. The most menacing of them all was the notice from the pharmacy, a polite but firm reminder that her mother's medication, the cocktail of pills that kept the tremors in her hands at bay and the fog from her mind, was ready for pickup, and its cost was astronomical. The thought of it was a cold knot in Alara's stomach, tighter than any hunger pang. Her mother, Maya, was her whole world, a woman whose own vibrant life had been slowly dimmed by a cruel, degenerative illness. Alara worked double shifts, picked up every extra hour she could, all to keep that light from flickering out. "Carter, table 4 needs a wipe down now." The voice of her boss, Mr. Henderson, sliced through the diner's low hum. He was a man whose own disappointments had curdled into a permanent sneer. He stood by the cash register, his arms crossed over his portly stomach, his eyes missing nothing and forgiving less. He took a particular, unpleasant pleasure in managing Alara, his critiques always a little sharper, his demands a little more unreasonable. He saw her quiet dignity not as a strength, but as a challenge to his authority. "On it, Mr. Henderson," Alara replied, her voice even. She grabbed a damp cloth and moved toward table 4, her feet aching in their worn-out shoes. As she wiped away the sticky rings left by a soda, the diner's bell chimed, announcing a new arrival. A gust of cold, wet air swept in, carrying a man who seemed to be composed of the storm itself. He was old, perhaps in his late 70s, with a thin frame hunched against a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. His coat was threadbare, darkened with rain, and his shoes looked as if they had walked 1,000 miles too many. He moved slowly, deliberately, his eyes scanning the room with a quiet, piercing intelligence that seemed at odds with his destitute appearance. He chose a small booth in the far corner, away from the other patrons, and sank onto the cracked vinyl seat as if the simple act required all his remaining energy. Mr. Henderson shot a look of pure annoyance toward the corner. "Great!" he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Alara to hear. "Another loiterer. Don't waste your time on him, Carter. Get him a water and that's it." "He's not going to order." Alara's gaze drifted to the old man. She saw the deep lines etched around his eyes, the slight tremble in his hands as he folded them on the tabletop. There was a profound loneliness about him, a stillness that seemed to absorb the diner's noise. In him, she saw a reflection of the world's casual cruelty, the way it wore people down, leaving them exposed and shivering in the rain. Her heart, already heavy with her own worries, felt a pang of deep, unbidden empathy. It was a feeling she couldn't afford, a luxury her precarious life didn't allow for, but it was there all the same, a stubborn, unquenchable flame of compassion. Disobeying her boss's unspoken order, she picked up a menu, filled a clean glass with ice water, and walked toward the corner booth, her shield-like smile replaced by something softer, something genuine, something that might just get her into trouble. Alara approached the corner booth, the sounds of the diner fading into a dull roar behind her. The old man looked up as she drew near, his eyes a startlingly clear shade of blue, like a winter sky. They held a depth of sorrow she recognized, for it was a mirror to the exhaustion she felt in her own soul. "Good evening, sir," she said softly, placing the glass of water on the table. "Can I get you started with something warm? The coffee's fresh." He offered a small, weary smile. "Just the water is fine for now. Thank you, young lady." His voice was a low rumble, raspy from disuse or age. He didn't open the menu she'd placed beside him. His gaze drifted to the window, watching the rain trace frantic paths down the glass. Alara hesitated. Mr. Henderson's glare was a physical force she could feel from across the room. She knew the rules. Engage paying customers, turn tables quickly, maximize profits. This man, with his soaked coat and empty pockets, represented the opposite of that ethos. But something held her there. It was the quiet dignity in his posture, the way he held himself as if he were sitting in a king's court instead of a greasy spoon diner. "The storm looks like it's settling in for the night," she offered, trying to fill the silence. "It's a good night to be indoors." "It is," he agreed, his eyes still on the window. "Sometimes the storm is more peaceful on the inside, looking out." His words hung in the air, simple yet profound. Alara felt a strange sense of kinship with this stranger. She, too, often felt like she was watching a storm rage just outside the fragile shelter of her life. She nodded, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "Carter, table 6 wants their check." Henderson's voice was a whip crack. "Coming," she called back, her shoulders tightening. She gave the old man another small smile. "Take your time, sir. No need to rush back out into that." For the next hour, Alara moved in a frantic ballet of service. She took orders, delivered plates of steaming food, refilled drinks, and cleared tables, all under the scrutinizing gaze of her boss. Yet, her awareness kept returning to the man in the corner. He hadn't moved. He just sat there, nursing his water, a solitary island in the bustling diner. Other customers came and went, their laughter and chatter filling the space, but he remained a silent, watchful presence. Finally, a lull descended. The dinner rush was over, leaving only a few stragglers. Mr. Henderson was tallying receipts at the register, his back to the room. Alara took her chance. She poured a fresh, hot cup of coffee, grabbed a bowl, and ladled it full of the hearty beef stew that was the day's special. It was thick with potatoes and carrots, fragrant with thyme, the kind of meal that warmed you from the inside out. She placed the bowl and the mug on a tray and walked back to the corner booth. The man looked up in surprise as she set the food before him. I didn't order this," he said, his brow furrowing in confusion. "I know," Alara said, keeping her voice low. "It's from the kitchen. Sometimes there are extras. It's better it goes to someone who can enjoy it than in the trash." It was a lie, a flimsy one, but it was the only one she could think of. The cost of the stew would come directly from her tip jar. "Please," she urged gently, "eat. You look like you could use something hot." For a moment, the man's composure seemed to crack. A flicker of profound emotion, gratitude so intense it was almost painful, crossed his face before he masked it again. He looked from the steaming bowl to her face, his blue eyes searching hers. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Alara thought of her mother. She thought of the countless times they had depended on the small kindnesses of others. A neighbor bringing over a casserole, a doctor waiving a copay. "Because everyone deserves a little warmth on a cold night," she answered simply. "No one should have to face the storm alone." He picked up the spoon, his hand trembling slightly. He didn't say anything else, but as he took the first spoonful of stew, his eyes closed for a second, and a long, slow breath escaped him. It was a sound of pure relief. Alara felt a warmth spread through her own chest, a feeling more potent than any coffee. It was the quiet satisfaction of having eased someone's burden, even for a moment. But the feeling was short-lived. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Mr. Henderson's voice was dangerously low, a venomous hiss right behind her. Alara froze, her back rigid. She turned slowly to face him. His face was mottled with rage, his eyes narrowed to slits. "I told you not to waste time on him," he seethed, jabbing a finger toward the old man, who had paused with his spoon halfway to his mouth. "And now you're giving away my inventory? My food? Are you insane?" "Mr. Henderson, it was just going to be thrown out," she began, her own voice trembling slightly. "Liar," he spat. "I run a tight ship here, Carter. There are no extras that comes out of my bottom line. And it's coming out of your job." He straightened up, his voice rising to a theatrical volume that drew the attention of the remaining customers. "You're fired. Get your things and get out. I won't have a thief working for me." The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Thief. Humiliation washed over Alara in a hot, sickening wave. Her face burned. She could feel the other patrons staring, their curiosity mixed with pity. "Sir, please, it was my fault," the old man said, rising shakily from his seat. "The young lady was just being charitable. I can." "You can shut your mouth and get out of my establishment," Henderson snarled, turning his fury on him. "Both of you. Now." Tears pricked at Alara's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of him. With as much dignity as she could muster, she untied her stained apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter. She didn't look at Henderson. She couldn't. She walked to the small staff locker, retrieved her worn coat and her purse, which felt impossibly light. As she walked toward the door, she risked a glance at the old man. He was standing by the booth, his face a mask of cold, unreadable fury. His eyes met hers, and in them, she saw not the frailty of an old man, but something else entirely, something hard and powerful. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but she just shook her head slightly and pushed the door open, stepping out into the cold, unforgiving rain. The bell chimed her exit, a final, mocking little sound. Her life had just been shattered, and all for a bowl of stew. The walk home was a blur of rain and tears. Each step was heavy, each splash of a passing car a fresh insult. The city lights, usually a source of comfort, now seemed to mock her with their brilliance. Fired. The word echoed in her mind, a death knell for her hopes. How could she face her mother? How could she explain that her compassion, the very quality Maya had instilled in her, had cost them everything? When she finally reached her small, third-floor apartment, she was soaked to the bone. She let herself in quietly, hoping her mother was asleep. The apartment was meager but spotless, filled with the scent of lavender from the sachets Maya liked to keep in her drawers. In the living room, a single lamp cast a warm glow on the worn armchair where her mother was sitting, a book lying open in her lap, her eyes closed. "Manga," Alara whispered, her voice thick. Maya's eyes fluttered open. They were the same clear blue as the old man's in the diner, a detail that struck Alara with sudden, jarring force. "Lara, baby, you're so late, and you're drenched." Maya's voice was soft, but a slight tremor ran through it, a constant reminder of her illness. She started to push herself up. "No, stay put," Alara said quickly, forcing a smile that felt like cracking glass. "It was just a busy night." Long story, she couldn't bring herself to tell the truth. Not yet. She couldn't bear to see the worry that would instantly cloud her mother's face. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the sky was a uniform, depressing gray. Alara sat at the kitchen table, staring at the classified section of the newspaper, a pit of dread in her stomach. Waitress, dishwasher, cleaner. The options were a bleak landscape of minimum wage and exhaustion. Her savings, a pitifully small amount tucked into a jar, wouldn't even cover the next medication refill, let alone rent. Desperation was a physical presence in the room, cold and suffocating. She was circling a listing for a night shift janitor when a sound from the street below broke her concentration. It was the low, purring engine of a high-end car, a sound utterly alien to their humble neighborhood. Peeking through the blinds, Alara saw a gleaming black sedan, the kind she only ever saw in movies, parked at the curb. A man in a crisp, dark suit emerged from the passenger side, looked at a piece of paper in his hand, and then gazed up directly at her building. A knot of anxiety tightened in her chest. Was it the landlord? A collections agency? The man walked with an air of brisk, no-nonsense purpose, disappearing into the building's entrance. A moment later, there was a firm, polite knock on her door. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She took a deep breath, smoothed down her sweater, and opened the door a crack. The man from the car stood there. He was middle-aged, with silvering hair and a calm, professional demeanor. "Miss Alara Carter?" he asked. His voice was polite, but carried an undertone of authority. "Yes," she answered, her voice barely a whisper. "My name is Arthur Pendleton. I am the executive assistant to Mr. Alistair Vance." He paused, as if the name should mean something to her. "Didn't. My employer has sent me to find you. He would like to request a meeting with you at your earliest convenience." Alara stared at him, bewildered. "A meeting? With me? I don't understand. Who is Mr. Vance?" "Mr. Vance is the founder and CEO of Vance Enterprises," Arthur explained patiently. "He has a matter of some urgency he wishes to discuss with you personally." Vance Enterprises. The name clicked into place with a sickening lurch. It was the massive, faceless corporation that owned hundreds of businesses across the country, including the franchise of the Corner Spoon. Her stomach twisted. Were they going to sue her for the bowl of stew? Was Henderson's vindictiveness so complete that he had reported her to the highest levels of the company? "I think there's been a mistake," she said, her hand tightening on the doorknob. "I was fired from one of your company's diners last night. I don't have anything to say to your boss." "There is no mistake, Miss Carter," Arthur said, his expression unreadable. "In fact, your dismissal last night is precisely why Mr. Vance wishes to speak with you. He has made an unorthodox offer. He has instructed me to escort you to his office at Vance Tower immediately. Should you agree?" He held out a business card. It was thick, expensive cardstock, embossed with a simple, elegant V. "He believes the meeting will be very much to your benefit." Alara's mind raced. This made no sense. Why would the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation care about a fired waitress? Suspicion warred with a desperate, flickering ember of hope. What if this wasn't a punishment? What if it was something else? She had nothing left to lose. Her job was gone. Her savings were dwindling. The alternative was to sit here and watch her world collapse. Taking a shaky breath, she made a decision. "Okay," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'll go." The ride to Vance Tower was a surreal journey from one world to another. The familiar, gritty streets of her neighborhood gave way to the gleaming steel and glass canyons of the financial district. Vance Tower was the tallest of them all, a monument of dark glass that seemed to pierce the gray sky. Arthur escorted her through a cavernous, marble-floored lobby, past a phalanx of security guards, and into a private elevator that ascended with silent, breathtaking speed. Her ears popped. The elevator opened directly into a penthouse office that was larger than her entire apartment building. One entire wall was a floor-to-ceiling window, offering a godlike view of the city sprawling below. The space was furnished with minimalist elegance. A massive mahogany desk, sleek leather chairs, and abstract art that probably cost more than her mother's lifetime of medical bills. And sitting behind the desk, looking out at the city, was a man in a perfectly tailored gray suit. As he swiveled his chair around to face her, Alara's breath caught in her throat. It was him, the old man from the diner. He was no longer hunched and weary. He stood tall, his posture exuding an aura of immense power and control. The threadbare coat was gone, replaced by fine wool. The haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by the same sharp, piercing intelligence she had first noticed, now amplified by his position of authority. His startlingly blue eyes, the same shade as her mother's, met hers across the vast expanse of the office. "Miss Carter," Alistair Vance said, his voice the same low rumble, but now stripped of its feigned frailty. "Thank you for coming. Please have a seat. I believe we have a great deal to discuss. And first, I owe you an apology." Alara stood frozen in the doorway of the opulent office, her mind struggling to reconcile the two images of the man before her. The destitute stranger shivering in the rain, and the powerful billionaire commanding this empire from the sky. They were the same person. The realization sent a dizzying wave of confusion and anger through her. "You," she breathed, the single word laden with accusation. "It was you." Alistair Vance inclined his head, a flicker of what looked like genuine remorse in his eyes. "It was, and I am truly sorry for the deception, and for what you endured last night. There is no excuse for Mr. Henderson's behavior, and I assure you, it has been dealt with." "Dealt with?" Alara found her voice, and it was sharper than she intended. "What does that mean? And why? Why were you there, dressed like that? Was it some kind of game for you? A rich man's amusement, to see how the little people live?" The bitterness she had suppressed for so long began to surface. "It was not a game," he said, his tone serious. "It was a test. I've been out of touch with the daily operations of my own company for too long. I've been told for years that the heart has gone out of the business, that we've become just another faceless corporation. I wanted to see for myself. I go, from time to my own establishments to see if the values I tried to build this company on still exist." He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Please, Alara. May I call you Alara?" She gave a stiff nod and cautiously sat on the edge of the plush leather chair. It felt like sinking into a cloud, a stark contrast to the rigid vinyl of the diner booths. "Most of what I found was discouraging," Alistair continued, his gaze distant. "Apathy, indifference. Managers like Henderson who value profit margins over human decency. But then there was you." He leaned forward, his blue eyes locking onto hers. "You showed compassion when you had every reason not to. You risked your job, your livelihood, for a stranger who you thought had nothing. You didn't just pass my test, Alara. You embodied the very spirit I thought was lost." He paused, letting his words sink in. "That is why I am offering you your job back. Not at the Corner Spoon. I am offering you a position here at corporate headquarters. A new role in employee relations and training, with a salary that will ensure you and your mother never have to worry about medical bills or rent again." Alara stared at him, speechless. A job, a real career. The offer was a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. The relief was so sudden, so overwhelming, it almost brought her to tears. But the suspicion lingered. It was too much, too fast. "Why would you do that for me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Just because I gave you a bowl of stew." Alistair's expression softened. "It was never about the stew. It was about the fact that you saw a human being in need and you acted without thought for yourself. Integrity like yours is rarer than gold, Alara, and far more valuable." As he spoke, his gaze drifted down to her neck. She instinctively reached up, her fingers closing around the small, cool object that always rested against her skin. Her locket. It was a simple silver oval, tarnished with age, with a delicate engraving of a single soaring bird on its surface. It had been her father's. Her mother had given it to her on her 16th birthday, telling her it was the only thing she had left of him. Alistair's eyes widened, his focus narrowing on the locket clutched in her hand. The air in the room shifted. The professional demeanor of the billionaire vanished, replaced by a raw, unguarded intensity. "That locket," he said, his voice suddenly strained. "Where did you get it?" Alara frowned, taken aback by the sudden change in his tone. "It was my father's," she said, her fingers tightening around it protectively. "My mother gave it to me." "Why?" Alistair stood up slowly, his movements stiff, as if he were in a trance. He walked around the massive desk until he was standing just a few feet from her. "Your father, what was his name?" he asked, his voice tight with an emotion she couldn't decipher. "David," she answered. "David Carter." At the name, Alistair flinched as if he'd been struck. A wave of emotions washed over his face. Shock, disbelief, and a profound, heart-wrenching sorrow. He looked from her face, to the locket, and back to her face, a dawning, impossible recognition in his eyes. "David Carter," he repeated, the name a ghost on his lips. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. With trembling fingers, he extracted a folded, yellowed photograph. He held it out to her. Alara took it hesitantly. The photograph was old, the colors faded. It showed two young men in their early 20s, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the unbridled optimism of youth. One of them was unmistakably a young Alistair Vance, his hair darker, his face unlined. The other man, Alara's breath hitched. He had her eyes, her smile, the same strong jawline she saw in her own reflection. It was the father she had never known. And around the young man's neck, gleaming even in the faded photograph, was the locket. Her locket. "I knew your father, Alara," Alistair said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "He wasn't just someone I knew. David Carter was my best friend. We were brothers." The polished silence of the office was shattered by the sharp click of the door opening. A young man, exuding an air of effortless entitlement, strode in. He was handsome in a severe corporate way, dressed in a suit that was even more expensive than Alistair's. He had the same blue eyes, but where Alistair's held a deep well of experience and sorrow, this man's were cold and assessing. "Uncle," he said, his voice smooth as silk but with an edge of impatience. "Arthur said you had a guest. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." His eyes slid over to Alara, dismissing her in a single sweeping glance. He saw a young woman in a worn sweater, clearly out of her element, and his lip curled in a faint, almost imperceptible sneer. "Julian," Alistair said, his tone turning cool. He didn't take his eyes off Alara. "This is Miss Alara Carter." "Alara, this is my nephew, Julian Vance." Julian's gaze sharpened, a flicker of interest replacing his boredom. "Carter?" he repeated, a note of condescending curiosity in his voice. "Any relation to the diner incident I just heard about? Henderson's termination paperwork just hit my desk. Quite the dramatic exit, I'm told. Alara is my guest, Julian. And the diner incident is closed," Alistair stated, his voice firm, a clear warning. But Julian was like a shark that had scented blood. He ignored his uncle's tone, his eyes fixed on Alara. "So you're the one, the waitress with the heart of gold," he said, his words dripping with sarcasm. "My uncle has always had a soft spot for a sob story. I must say you've landed on your feet. From a greasy spoon to the penthouse office in less than 24 hours. That's quite a promotion." Alara flinched, color rising in her cheeks. His words were designed to make her feel small, to frame her as an opportunist. "That's enough, Julian," Alistair snapped, his voice like cracking ice. He turned back to Alara, his expression softening again, trying to shield her from his nephew's venom. "Alara, your father," he began, his voice filled with a desperate urgency. "The locket. I gave it to him. It was a matched set. I have the other 1 inch." He fumbled at the collar of his own shirt, pulling out a silver chain. Dangling from it was another locket, identical in shape, but this one was engraved with a compass rose. A bird to find its way, and a compass to guide it home. "That's what we said." He looked at her, his eyes pleading for her to understand the magnitude of what he was saying. After we lost touch, I searched for him for years, but he vanished. It was like he fell off the face of the earth. I never knew he had a daughter." Julian let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Uncle, please, you can't be serious. You meet a down-on-her-luck waitress for 5 minutes. She has a piece of old jewelry, and suddenly you think you found the long-lost daughter of your mythical best friend? It's a touching story, but let's be realistic." He stepped forward, his posture radiating a predatory confidence. "Miss Carter, I'm sure this is all very overwhelming for you, But you have to understand, my uncle is a very wealthy man. People try to take advantage of his sentimentality all the time. Coincidences happen. A locket like that, it's not exactly unique. It is unique, Alistair insisted, his voice low and dangerous. It was custom-made. There are only 2 in the world. Is that so? Julian raised a skeptical eyebrow. He turned his full attention to Alara, his smile a cold, polished thing. I'm the head of risk management for this company, Miss Carter. It's my job to protect my uncle and this family's interests. We'll, of course, have to do a thorough background check. Verify your identity, your mother's history, your father's records. It's just standard procedure, you understand. We have to be sure you are who you say you are. The implication was clear. He wasn't just casting doubt, he was issuing a threat. He would dig into her life, her poverty, her mother's illness, and he would use whatever he found to discredit her. He saw her not as a person, but as a problem to be managed, a potential threat to his inheritance. Alara felt a chill run down her spine. Just moments ago, she had been offered a lifeline, a chance at a new beginning. Now, she was standing in the crossfire of a family drama she didn't understand, with a powerful enemy who had already decided she was a fraud. The hope that had bloomed in her chest was now choked with a thorny vine of fear and suspicion. She clutched the old photograph in one hand and her locket in the other. They were the only proof she had, tangible links to a father she'd never met and a past that was suddenly, terrifyingly, coming alive. Alistair's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. He took a step forward, placing himself slightly between Alara and his nephew, a subtle but unmistakable act of protection. Your standard procedure will be conducted by an independent party of my choosing, Julian, not by your corporate hyenas. Is that understood? Julian's charming smile didn't falter, but a flicker of resentment flashed in his eyes. Of course, Uncle. Whatever you think is best. We just want to ensure everything is above board. For everyone's sake, he gave Alara one last, lingering look, a silent promise of scrutiny, before turning on his heel. I have a meeting. We'll speak later. With that, he was gone, the door closing with a soft, final click behind him. The tension in the room remained, thick and suffocating. Alistair let out a long, weary sigh, the anger draining from him to be replaced by a familiar sorrow. I apologize for that, he said, turning back to Alara. Julian, he was raised by my father. He has his grandfather's cynicism. He seemed to wrestle with himself for a moment before his resolve hardened. He's right about one thing. We need to know the truth, but not to discredit you. To honor your father, he walked over to a section of the office wall that looked like simple wood paneling. He pressed a discreet spot, and a panel slid open with a quiet hiss, revealing a large, formidable safe. He spun the dial with practiced ease, the tumblers clicking into place, and pulled the heavy door open. Come, he said, gesturing for her to follow. There are things you need to see. Alara followed him into a small, climate-controlled vault that was more of a private study. It was lined with shelves holding leather-bound books and archival boxes. The air smelled of old paper and leather. It felt like a sacred space, a tomb of memories. Alistair went to one of the boxes, lifted the lid, and began to carefully remove its contents, laying them on a large wooden table in the center of the room. There were stacks of letters, tied with faded ribbon. More photographs showing Alistair and David on hiking trips, working on a beat-up old car, celebrating a birthday with a lopsided cake. In every picture, their bond was palpable, a vibrant, living thing captured in silver nitrate. We met in a freshman economics class, Alistair began, his voice soft with reminiscence as he handled the items with reverence. I was the rich kid who was expected to be there. He was the scholarship student who had fought for his spot, smarter than everyone in the room, including the professor. We were opposites in every way, but we just clicked. He picked up a letter and handed it to Alara. The handwriting was bold and confident, slanting across the page. It was a letter from David to Alistair, written during a summer break. Alara's fingers trembled as she read her father's words. He wrote of his dreams, his ideas, his unwavering belief that he and Alistair were destined to build something great together. He was the visionary, Alistair said, a sad smile touching his lips. I had the capital thanks to my family, but David had the ideas. The first diner, the corner spoon, the original one, not the franchise you worked at, it was his concept. He believed that a good meal and a kind ear could be a lifeline for people. He wanted to create spaces where everyone felt welcome, regardless of what was in their pockets. Then, Alistair pulled out a larger, more formal document from the bottom of the box. It was bound in blue cardstock, the type crisp and official. He laid it on the table under the light. And this, he said, his voice dropping, is what Julian is truly afraid of. Alara leaned closer. The document was titled, Partnership Agreement for the North Star Diner Company. She scanned the text, her eyes catching on the key phrases, equal partners, 50% ownership, joint venture, and there, at the bottom, were two signatures, side by side, dated over 30 years ago. One was a flourishing, confident Alistair M. Vance, the other, in the same bold script as the letters, was David J. Carter. The air left Alara's lungs in a rush. This wasn't just a story about a lost friendship. This piece of paper changed everything. If this was legally binding, then her father wasn't just the forgotten visionary behind the company. He was its co-founder, its co-owner, and she was his heir. The implications were staggering, a universe away from worrying about the price of a bowl of stew. She wasn't just the daughter of Alistair's friend. She was potentially the heiress to half of a multi-billion-dollar empire. But what happened? She whispered, looking up at Alistair, her mind reeling. You said you lost touch. Why would he just walk away from this? From you? Alistair's face clouded over, the old pain returning, sharp and fresh. We had an argument, he said, his voice heavy with a guilt that had festered for decades. A terrible one. Money had gone missing from the business accounts. Not a lot, but enough. The evidence, it all pointed to David. My father brought it to me. He said David was taking advantage of me, skimming off the top. He looked away, unable to meet her eyes. I was young, arrogant. I felt betrayed. I confronted him. I accused him. I said things, unforgivable things. He shook his head, the memory still raw. David denied it, of course. He was devastated that I would even think it of him. We shouted, and then he just walked out. I expected him to call the next day, for us to cool down and sort it out. But he never did. He disappeared. I tried to find him, but all the trails went cold. I assumed he was ashamed, or that he hated me so much he wanted nothing more to do with me or our dream. So I carried on alone. I built this. He swept a hand around, indicating the tower, the city, the empire, on the foundation of what we started, but I always felt like a fraud, because it was supposed to be ours. He finally met her gaze, his eyes filled with a desperate hope. I was wrong, Alara. I have to believe I was wrong about him. Finding you, it's a chance to make it right, to restore his name, his legacy. A new fire ignited within Alara. This was no longer just about her or her mother. This was about her father, a man she had never known, whose name had been tarnished, whose dream had been stolen. The fear Julian had instilled in her began to recede, replaced by a fierce, protective resolve. She looked down at the partnership agreement, at her father's strong signature. It was a promise, and she would see it kept. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Alistair, true to his word, moved Alara and her mother out of their cramped apartment and into a comfortable, fully furnished suite in a residential hotel owned by his company. For the first time in years, Maya had a spacious, sunlit room, a comfortable bed, and round-the-clock access to nursing care. A team of the city's best specialists was brought in to review her case, their consultations covered by Alistair's personal account. Seeing the lines of pain and worry begin to ease from her mother's face was a balm to Alara's soul, strengthening her resolve for the fight that lay ahead. Meanwhile, Julian Vance's campaign of subtle warfare began in earnest. He couldn't openly defy Alistair, but he worked from the shadows, a master of corporate sabotage. An article appeared in a prominent business journal, a profile on Vance Enterprises that painted Alastair as an aging, sentimental eccentric, increasingly disconnected from his own company and susceptible to influence. It hinted at a mysterious new presence in his life, raising questions about the company's future stability. The article didn't name Alara, but the implication was clear and poisonous. Then Julian made his move directly. He requested a private meeting with Alara, framing it as an attempt to clear the air. They met not in the sterile power of Vance Tower, but in a quiet, private lounge at an exclusive club. The setting was chosen to intimidate, a world of old money and unspoken rules where Alara would feel like an intruder. Julian was the picture of civility, ordering her a ridiculously expensive tea and making small talk. But beneath the polished veneer, his eyes were cold and calculating. "Alara," he began, setting his cup down with a delicate clink. "I think we got off on the wrong foot. I want you to understand my position. I've dedicated my entire life to this company. I've worked my way up, earning my place. My uncle, he's a brilliant man, but his heart sometimes rules his head. He's chasing a ghost, a memory from his youth. And he's put you in a very difficult position." "I'm not in a difficult position," Alara said, her voice steady. She refused to be cowed. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." A flicker of annoyance crossed Julian's face. "Let's be direct, then," he said, his tone hardening. "My uncle is on a crusade. He's prepared to tear this company apart, to publicly dredge up a 30-year-old squabble, all to prove a point. The board is nervous. Our investors are getting skittish. This will be a messy public battle. The media will descend on you. They will dig into every corner of your life, your mother's illness, your financial struggles. They will paint you as a con artist, a gold digger who preyed on a lonely old man. Whether it's true or not won't matter. The mud will stick." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But it doesn't have to be that way. I am prepared to make you an offer. A way for you to walk away from all of this with your dignity and your future secure." He slid a thick envelope across the table. "Inside that envelope is a cashier's check for $5 million. It's yours. No taxes, no strings. Enough to buy a beautiful home, to ensure your mother has the best care money can buy for the rest of her life. Enough for you to never have to work another day if you don't want to." Alara stared at the envelope. $5 million. The number was abstract, unreal. It was a solution to every problem she had ever had. It was safety. It was peace. It was an end to the constant, grinding worry that had been her companion for years. She thought of her mother, of the relief she could give her, the final and absolute removal of every burden. The temptation was immense, a physical pull. "What's the catch?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Simple," Julian said smoothly. "There is also a document in that envelope, a non-disclosure agreement. You sign it, you agree that this was all a misunderstanding, a series of unfortunate coincidences. You disavow any and all claims to your father's supposed stake in the company. You walk away from Alastair, from Vance Enterprises, and you never look back. You get a clean break and a very, very comfortable life." This was it, the test, her moment of choice. She could take the money, the easy way out. No one would blame her. She could justify it 100 ways. It was a fortune beyond her wildest dreams, offered freely. But then, she thought of the photograph of her father, his arm thrown around his best friend, his face alight with hope. She thought of his letters, filled with passion and ideas. She thought of his signature on the partnership agreement, a testament to his dream. Julian wasn't just offering her money. He was asking her to sell her father's legacy, to agree that his life's work meant nothing, to participate in the final erasure of David Carter from history. She looked at the envelope, then up at Julian's expectant, smug face. He thought he knew her. He thought that, like everyone else he'd ever met, she had a price. He had sized her up, seen her worn clothes and her history of poverty, and he was certain he had found it. Slowly, Deliberately, Alara pushed the envelope back across the table. "No," she said. Julian's smile faltered. "I don't think you understand." "I understand perfectly," Alara interrupted, her voice ringing with a clarity and strength that surprised even herself. "You think this is about money. You think you can buy my father's honor. You think you can put a price on his name, on his dream." She stood up, her chair scraping against the polished floor. She looked down at him, at this man who had everything and valued nothing. "My father's legacy is not for sale, Julian. Not for 5 million, not for 100 million. You can't buy the truth. And I'm not going anywhere." She turned and walked out of the lounge, leaving him sitting there with his envelope and his shock. She didn't look back. The air outside, even the city's exhaust-filled breeze, felt clean and pure. She had been tested, and she had not been broken. She had made her choice. She would fight. Alara's refusal was a declaration of war. When Alistair heard what she had done, what Julian had offered, and how she had responded, any lingering doubt he might have had was vaporized. He saw in her the same unwavering integrity he had once so admired in her father. His mission to uncover the truth became an all-consuming obsession, fueled now by a protective fury on Alara's behalf. He bypassed Julian's corporate cronies and hired a man named Marcus Thorne, a retired detective turned private investigator with a legendary reputation for unearthing secrets that powerful people wanted to keep buried. Thorne was old school, methodical, patient, and relentless. Alistair gave him a simple directive: find out what really happened to David Carter. Spare no expense. Follow the truth, wherever it leads. Thorne started with the story Alistair had carried for 30 years. The argument, the accusation of embezzlement, David's disappearance. He began digging into the financial records of the original North Star Diner Company from that fateful year. The corporate archives, digitized and sterile, showed the discrepancy Alistair remembered: a series of small cash withdrawals over several weeks, totaling about $5,000, all signed out with a forged signature that vaguely resembled David's. But Thorne didn't stop there. He went deeper, hunting for the source physical documents, the original cash-out slips and ledgers from a time before everything was on a server. He found them in a dusty, forgotten storage facility in New Jersey, in a crate marked Vance, Archive PRE, 1990. And in that crate he found the lie. The withdrawal slips had been tampered with. Thorne, using forensic analysis, discovered that the original signatures had been erased. Beneath the clumsy forgeries of David's name were the faint, indented remnants of another, Cyrus Vance, Alistair's father. The discovery was a bombshell. It wasn't David who had taken the money. It was Cyrus, Alistair's own father, who had orchestrated the theft specifically to frame his son's best friend. The motive was the next piece of the puzzle. Thorne began investigating Cyrus Vance, a man who had been a titan of industry in his day, known for his ruthless business practices and his iron-fisted control over his family. He interviewed retired executives who had worked for the elder Vance, men now in their 80s and 90s, long divested from the world of corporate intrigue. One name kept coming up: a man named Robert Fincher, who had been Cyrus's personal accountant and right-hand man for 40 years. Fincher was now living in a quiet retirement community in Florida. Thorne flew down immediately. At first, Fincher was tight-lipped, loyal to his former employer even in death. But Thorne was persuasive. He didn't threaten. He appealed to the man's conscience. He spoke of a daughter who never knew her father, of a legacy stolen, of a friendship destroyed by a lie. He showed Fincher a picture of Alara. Finally, the old man broke. His confession, recorded by Thorne, was the final, devastating key that unlocked the entire conspiracy. Cyrus hated David, Fincher said, his voice thin and reedy with age. He saw him as a parasite, this brilliant, charming boy from the wrong side of the tracks who had his son, his heir, completely captivated. Cyrus believed in pedigree, in power. David had neither. What he had was influence over Alistair, and Cyrus couldn't stand that. He called David the dreamer, and he said it like it was a disease. According to Fincher, Cyrus saw the partnership, the 50-50 split, as an existential threat. He wasn't just going to let his family's fortune be diluted by a partnership with a nobody. He had to sever the connection. Permanently. The embezzlement frame-up was just the first step, Fincher explained, his eyes watering with the memory. It was designed to poison Alistair against his friend, to use Alistair's own pride to drive David away. And it worked, better than Cyrus could have hoped. But it didn't end there. After the terrible argument, after David left town, heartbroken and disgraced, Cyrus sent his men to find him. David had moved to a small town a few states away, trying to start over. He'd met a young woman there, Maya. He was working a menial job, trying to save up enough to clear his name. Cyrus's men delivered a message, Fincher recounted, his voice trembling. They told David that if he ever tried to contact Alistair again, if he ever came near the company, they would not only ruin him completely, but they would harm the people Alistair loved. They even hinted at harming Alistair himself, framing it as a consequence of David's meddling. And they told him they knew about Maya. They made it clear she would be in danger, too. They forced David into a life of exile and silence. He was trapped. To protect the woman he loved, and the friend who had betrayed him but whom he still cared for, he had to remain a ghost. He lived in poverty, his spirit broken, his dreams turned to ash. Then came the final, chilling revelation. A few years later, David Carter died. The official report called it a construction site accident, a fall from a scaffold. It was ruled a tragic mishap. It was no accident, Fincher whispered, tears now openly streaming down his wrinkled face. David had started writing a letter, a long letter to Alistair, telling him everything. He was going to risk it. He couldn't live with the lie anymore. One of Cyrus's informants found out. A week later, David was dead. Cyrus. He tied up the loose end. The full, monstrous truth was laid bare. Alistair hadn't been abandoned by his friend. His friend had been systematically destroyed by his own father. The guilt Alistair had carried for 3 decades, the guilt of a betrayed friend, was replaced by a far more horrific burden. The guilt of a son whose family had committed an unforgivable evil. The entire Vance empire, the towering symbol of his life's work, was built not just on a broken friendship, but on a foundation of lies, threats, and murder. And Alara and her mother were the living casualties of that long-buried crime. Alistair Vance sat in his cavernous office, the city lights twinkling like a galaxy of indifferent stars below. Marcus Thorne's report lay open on the mahogany desk, each word a hammer blow to the foundations of his world. The transcript of Robert Fincher's confession, the forensic analysis of the forged signatures, the timeline of his father's monstrous campaign against David Carter. It was all there, irrefutable and devastating. He didn't feel rage. Not yet. That would come later. What he felt was a profound, hollowing emptiness, a grief so vast it seemed to suck all the air from the room. His entire life, his entire identity as the man who built an empire from a single diner, was a lie. He hadn't built it alone. He had built it on the ghost of his murdered friend. His success was not a testament to his own brilliance, but a monument to his own blindness, a gilded cage built by his father's sins. He thought of David, grinning in those old photographs, his eyes alight with dreams. He thought of the man's slow, forced descent into poverty and despair. He thought of Alara, who had inherited her father's integrity but also his struggle, living a life of hardship just a few miles from the tower built with her birthright. The emptiness began to fill with a cold, clear purpose. The past could not be changed. The dead could not be brought back. But the truth could be told, and justice, however belated, could be served. He called for an emergency meeting of the Vance Enterprises Executive Board. He didn't state the reason, only that it was mandatory and of the utmost urgency. And he made 2 other calls. One to Alara, asking her to be there by his side. The other was to the head of his personal security team, a man fiercely loyal to him alone. The next afternoon, the board convened in the main conference room on the 80th floor. It was a sterile, intimidating space dominated by a massive granite table. The dozen or so board members, Silver-haired men and women who represented the pinnacle of the corporate world filed in, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Julian was the last to arrive, striding in with his usual air of confidence, though a faint hint of unease flickered in his eyes. He took his seat at the head of the table, opposite his uncle's empty chair, the position of the heir apparent. The doors opened again. Alistair Vance entered, but he was not alone. Alara was at his side. She was dressed simply but elegantly, in a dark dress Alistair's assistant had procured for her. She held her head high, her fear eclipsed by a quiet resolve. Her presence sent a ripple of murmurs around the table. Julian's confident smirk tightened into a thin, hard line. Alistair did not take his seat. He remained standing at the head of the table, Alara beside him. He looked down the long table at the faces staring back at him, faces of people who had built their careers on the success of his company. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice calm but resonating with an unshakable authority. "I have called this meeting to correct a lie that has been at the heart of this company for over 30 years. A lie that I myself have unknowingly perpetuated." He looked directly at Julian. "Some of you are aware that I recently reconnected with the daughter of an old friend, David Carter." He then looked at Alara. "This is his daughter, Alara Carter. For decades, I believed my friend and partner abandoned our shared dream. I have now learned the truth. He did not abandon it. It was stolen from him. His name was slandered, his life was destroyed, and his legacy was erased. By my own father, Cyrus Vance." A collective gasp went through the room. Board members exchanged shocked, disbelieving glances. Julian's face went pale. "I have here," Alistair continued, his voice ringing with cold fury as he held up Thorne's report, "irrefutable proof. Financial records proving David Carter was framed for embezzlement by my father. And a sworn, recorded confession from Cyrus's own accountant, detailing the conspiracy to ruin David, to threaten him into silence, and ultimately, to arrange his accidental death." He let the words hang in the air, the horror of them sinking in. He had the room's complete, horrified attention. Julian, seeing his entire world crumbling, finally broke his silence. "This is insane," he burst out, rising from his chair. "My uncle is clearly not well. He's being manipulated by this woman. She's fed him some fantasy, and in his grief, he's chosen to believe it. My grandfather was a hard man, but he was not a murderer. Wasn't he?" Alistair's voice was like steel. "You know, Julian, I wondered how deep this rot went. I wondered if it died with my father." He turned his piercing gaze fully on his nephew. "But then I remembered something. My father kept private journals. He recorded everything. I had them destroyed years ago, unable to face his particular brand of cruelty. Or so I thought." Alistair nodded to his head of security, who was standing discreetly by the door. The man stepped forward and placed a small, leather-bound book on the table. "Marcus Thorne is very good at his job," Alistair said softly. "He found this in your private safe at your country house, Julian. The one journal you kept. The one detailing my father's final years, and his dealings with David Carter." Julian stared at the journal as if it were a serpent. All the color drained from his face. "You knew," Alistair said. "The accusation of final, damning verdict. You've known all along. You found my father's journals, you learned the whole sordid truth, and you kept it secret. You saw it not as a crime to be exposed, but as a legacy to be protected. Your legacy." He took a step closer. "When Alara appeared, you didn't see the victim of a terrible injustice. You saw a threat to your inheritance. Your attempts to discredit her, to buy her off, that wasn't just corporate maneuvering. That was you continuing our family's crime. You chose to be your grandfather's grandson." Julian's composure finally shattered. His face twisted into a snarl of pure, arrogant fury. "And what if I did?" he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "Everything I did was to protect this company, to protect our family. That man was a nobody, a footnote. This empire was built by Avance, and it will be run by Avance. Not handed over to some charity case waitress from the gutter. His confession, born of pure hubris, hung in the silent room. He had admitted it, in front of the entire board. Alistair looked at him, not with anger anymore, but with a cold, profound pity. "You have just made your last decision as Avance," he said quietly. He nodded to the security chief. "Please escort Mr. Vance from the building. His access to all company property is revoked, effective immediately." 2 guards moved forward. Julian looked around wildly, his eyes pleading with the board members, but they looked away, their faces masks of shock and disgust. His arrogance had been his undoing. As the guards took his arms, he stared at Alara, his eyes burning with a hatred that was chilling in its intensity. And then he was gone. The climax was over. The truth was out. In the quiet that followed, Alistair Vance turned to the board. "David Carter was my 50-50 partner. As his sole heir, Alara Carter now owns half of this company. This is not open for discussion. This is a debt being paid. Our work begins now." The fallout was swift and decisive. Julian Vance was not only ejected from the company but also faced legal repercussions for his attempts at intimidation and his role in concealing a historical crime. His name was scrubbed from the corporate letterhead, his portraits removed from the walls, his presence erased as thoroughly as he had tried to erase David Carter. Justice, in the corporate sense, was absolute. The legal teams worked for weeks, but the outcome was never in doubt. With the original partnership agreement and the mountain of evidence Alistair had compiled, David Carter's co-founding stake in Vance Enterprises was formally and legally recognized. Overnight, Alara Carter went from being a former waitress drowning in debt to one of the wealthiest women in the country. But the money was secondary. Her first act, the one that truly mattered, was for her mother. Maya was moved from the residential hotel to a world-class private medical facility, a place that felt more like a spa than a hospital. With the pressure of finances and worry lifted, and with access to cutting-edge treatments, a remarkable transformation began. The tremors lessened. The fog in her mind started to clear. The vibrant, laughing woman Alara remembered from her childhood began to re-emerge, piece by piece. The first time Maya was able to hold a teacup without spilling it, she and Alara wept together, tears not of sorrow, but of overwhelming joy. Alistair, for his part, began the painful but necessary process of atoning. He made a formal, public apology, not through a press release, but in a televised interview where he laid the entire sordid history bare. He spoke of his own failings, his own blindness, and his profound debt to his friend. Then, he went to Alara, not in his office or in a boardroom, but in the quiet garden of the medical facility where Maya was recovering. He didn't offer platitudes or corporate speak. He just stood before her, the powerful billionaire stripped away, leaving only a man weighed down by a lifetime of grief and regret. "Alara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry. Those words are not enough. They will never be enough. I failed your father, as a friend, as a partner. I let my pride and my father's poison blind me. I can't give you back the years that were stolen. I can't give you back your father. But I can spend the rest of my life honoring his memory and honoring you." Alara looked at this man who was inextricably linked to her family's greatest tragedy, and she saw not an enemy, but another victim of Cyrus Vance's cruelty. She saw the lonely old man from the diner. She reached out and took his hand. "We can honor him together," she said. Her final piece of business was the corner spoon. She didn't shut it down. Instead, she used it as a model for change. Mr. Henderson was long gone, but she went further. She worked with Alistair to establish new company-wide policies. A living wage for all employees, comprehensive health benefits, profit-sharing programs, and a charitable foundation, the David Carter Foundation, funded with a significant portion of the company's annual profits, dedicated to providing educational grants and support for underprivileged youth. The spirit of the original North Star Diner Company was reborn. Months later, the autumn leaves were turning shades of gold and crimson outside the windows of a beautiful, light-filled house nestled in a quiet, wooded suburb. This was Alara's new home, but more importantly, it was Maya's. The sterile smell of hospitals had been replaced by the scent of baking bread. In the sun-drenched living room, Maya, looking years younger and healthier than she had in a decade, was seated across a chessboard from Alistair Vance. Her hand was steady as she moved her knight. "Check," she said, a playful glint in her clear blue eyes. Alistair smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile that reached his own eyes. "You have your husband's mind for strategy, Maya." Alara stood in the doorway watching them. He wasn't Mr. Vance anymore. He was Uncle Alistair. A strange, broken, but beautiful new family had been forged in the crucible of truth. On the mantelpiece, two objects sat side by side. One was the framed photograph of two young men, their arms around each other, ready to take on the world. The other was the tarnished silver locket, its engraved bird seeming to catch the afternoon light, forever soaring. She was no longer the struggling waitress, nor was she just a wealthy heiress. She was the head of her father's foundation, giving others the chances her father had been denied. She had found not just security but purpose. Her life was no longer a fraction of what it should have been. It was whole and it was hers. The story of Alara Carter serves as a powerful reminder that our true worth is not measured by our bank accounts or our job titles, but by the integrity in our hearts. One small act of kindness, a single refusal to bow to cynicism, can set in motion a chain of events that rights a generation of wrongs. It reminds us that legacies are not just about money or power. They are about the dreams we honor and the truths we have the courage to fight for. So, we must ask ourselves, in a world that often rewards cruelty and dismisses compassion, what choices will we make when our own character is put to the test? If this story of justice and redemption touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe for more content that celebrates the enduring power of the human spirit. Your support helps us continue to tell stories that matter.